Welcome to our special guest speaker, Mr. Mike Carlton, talking about HMAS Perth. Welcome to Alicia Farry, representing the publishers Random House. Welcome to, obviously, the members of the museum, and I know that there are a few people here with associations to people that served on the HMAS Perth, so welcome to you. I might just mention that the images that are up on the screen are not from Mike's book. If you want to see the images in Mike's book, you'll have to buy it, but these images are a combination from our collection, and I thank you to Lindsay Shaw, the curator of the Maritime Museum, for sourcing those, and also to the Royal Australian Navy from Spectacle Island for sourcing some of their images that they had hidden away on Spectacle Island. Mike Carlton is one of Australia's best-known broadcasters and newspaper journalists. In a journalistic career spanning 40 years, he's been a news reporter, editor, foreign correspondent, television current affairs reporter, an anchor, radio current affairs anchor, humorist and satirist. He was an ABC war correspondent in Vietnam in 1967 and 1970 and was also bureau chief in Indonesia. He recently retired from radio and now writes a regular column for the Sydney Morning Herald. And he's also a member of the Walkley Advisory Board. He is a lover of things maritime, and he's a paid-up member of the Maritime Museum and has been for some years. And you'll often find him wandering around admiring the ships and the heritage at this museum. So it's a privilege to have him here. So to talk about the book that he has always wanted to write, could you please make welcome Mr. Mike Carlton.
It is a great pleasure to be here this evening in such civilised company, people who love ships and the sea, and I hope people who love books. This is one of my favourite places in Sydney. I think it's one of the jewels of this city, in fact, one of the jewels of the nation, the National Maritime Museum. Writing this book has been very much a labour of love. I began my research for it just over 4 years ago, and as the publicity blurb says, and it's true, it's the book I've always wanted to write. Naval history has been a lifelong interest, a hobby, a diversion, a passion of mine since I was a teenager. I wanted to join the Navy for reasons I still to this day don't quite understand. I never did. And I got sort of sidetracked into journalism instead, which I guess was better paid, but probably wasn't as much fun. Perth, I first heard about her in a book by a fellow called Rowan Rivett. And then eventually, after a long, long time, I quite by chance happened to meet some of the survivors of this ship. And they started to talk, and I realised what an epic story it is of Australian courage and endurance, of great horror in some cases and tragedy, but in the end, in triumph, because they achieved what they set out to do. And I felt I had to write it. Perth was what they call a modified Leander-class cruiser, and an absolutely, as you can see it, a beautiful, powerful ship. Isn't that an elegant ship? Beneath that steel skin, she was pretty tough and powerful, 4 Parsons steam turbines, which could deliver a massive 72,000 horsepower to 4 shafts that turned the great bronze propellers beneath her stern. And that was a force enough to push aside 51,000 tonnes of seawater every minute and to propel her through the oceans at an officially calculated speed of just over 32 knots. And 32 knots is still a pretty damn good speed for a modern warship today. She had a displacement of 6,800 tonnes and overall 170 metres long. She carried 6-inch guns, 8 of them. Her secondary or anti-aircraft armament was of 8 rapid-firing 4-inch guns. She also carried 5 depth charges, which is an entirely useless number. As the crew sometimes joked, if they found a submarine, they would have had to have chucked beer bottles at it. But by all the standards of 1939, Perth was a fast and capable ship, and she packed a seriously powerful punch. In the 3 short years of her life, she fought in almost all the world's seas and oceans: the Atlantic, the Caribbean, the Mediterranean, the Aegean, the Pacific, the Indian Ocean, and finally in the seas off Java, where she met a brave but tragic end in 1942. Her crew were young, many of them still teenagers. The captain on this ship's last doomed voyage was the Navy's finest fighting sailor, Heck Waller. He was, I believe, the most remarkable naval officer Australia's produced. Character and dedication to duty sailed with Heckwaller, and his men were unstinting in their regard. He was a very informal fellow. He generally dressed as if he was going fishing. He'd have a rotten old beanie on his head and a dirty old jumper. He went down with Perth in her last hopeless battle, and many of his crew went with him. Many more died in Japanese prison camps. They were the only Australian sailors of the Second World War, really, ever captured by the enemy to endure the atrocities of the Burma-Siam Railway. Perth had 681 men on board on her last voyage. Only 218 of them made it back to Australia. There are perhaps only 25 of them left. A wonderful thing is that many of them kept diaries, and much of my book is constructed from those diaries, and of course too from interviews with the handful of men and their families who are now left with us. A lot of the diaries are held now in the War Memorial in Canberra, and to go through them there is a very moving experience when you realise you're holding the original document. Every so often in this research I was struck by an extraordinary piece of luck. When I was still on breakfast radio in Sydney, I was contacted out of the blue by a bloke named George Hatfield. He said his father had been in the ship. He'd just been going through his diaries and was typing them up. George Hatfield's diaries were brilliant, vibrant and fabulously descriptive. Not just of, we were bombed and we sailed from A to B and so on, but of the things they did, of the life they led, of what they did when they were ashore. But I'll tell you a bit of this ship's story. She was bought in 1939. They sent this bunch of young kids over to collect her. And the first port of call on the way back home was, in fact, across the Atlantic to New York, there to wave the Australian flag at the 1939 World's Fair, where they really let it rip. They painted New York red. The Australians were the toast of the town. So they kind of left New York with a monumental hangover, and war broke out as they were on their way back towards the Caribbean. So that they stayed in the Caribbean to chase up German merchant ships trying to get home from South American ports. Didn't have much luck hunting them down. She did survive a humongous hurricane off Bermuda, huge, which sorted out a very green ship's company. She spent Christmas Day in Kingston, Jamaica, where most of the crew got appallingly drunk on a huge barrel of rum that had been smuggled aboard as a thank you present from Kingston's most famous and respected brothel madam, who rejoiced in the name of Shanghai Lil. That was her name. And on the way back through the Pacific, they stopped over in Tahiti, where they got pretty much the same sort of welcome that Captain Cook and the Endeavour had experienced 150 years before. The visit culminating in a most enviable orgy of naked dancing and beach sex. It was huge. The captain, actually, before they arrived, Farncombe, the first Australian captain, came over the PA and said, "You realise, of course, that this is the infamous Islands of Love, a place of considerable sexual misbehaviour, and I expect you will behave like true Australian sailors." Indeed they did, but they had very different views on how it should be done. That trip across the Pacific was the end of innocence. From there on, the war was to get serious. By the end of 1940, they were in the Mediterranean to fight the Germans and the Italians as part of the British Navy's, the Royal Navy's Mediterranean Fleet. And they cleared the Suez Canal on Christmas Eve that year, 1940, and they spent Christmas Day in Alexandria, the great port city of Egypt. 1941 was a black year for the Allies in the Mediterranean, in Greece, in North Africa, in Crete. Perth encountered her first air raid on the first day of the new year, 41, and for the next 8 months she was under almost continuous air attack by day and night. By March, Perth was supporting that tragically ill-fated Allied invasion of Greece. And the next month again she was involved in yet another Allied fiasco in the battle for Crete. And at the end of May, Perth's luck finally ran out and she was hit by a bomb herself. 4 of her crew were killed, 2 cooks and 2 stokers, along with 9 soldiers who'd been on deck when the bomb went through. And that evening, they buried the dead at sea. On the way back to Alexandria, there was a low sunset, a Mediterranean sunset, And a young bloke, an able seaman from Sydney named Jim Nelson, was a duty bugler. And Jim was the bugler that night, and he wrote these words in his diary. As the bodies were committed to the sea, I had to sound the last post in Reveille. When the chaplain nodded to me to sound off, I was overcome with emotion. My lips went dry, and for a moment I could not raise a note. I closed my eyes, and by mind transportation took myself away from the ship and played as if I were back in harbour at a routine sunset. I played as I'd never played before. Every feeling in my body went through that instrument. I made the strident bugle tones as mellow and sweet as I could and lost myself in the production. And he concluded his entry in his diary for that day with these words, I am only 19 years old. What is expected of me? How much more can I give? It's heart-wrenching stuff. Battered and battle-weary, Perth returned to Australia in August 1941. By 1942, the stage was set for her last great act. Heck Waller had taken over command in Sydney. Singapore had fallen in February 1942. And the Japanese were advancing in force on the Netherlands East Indies, which hung by a thread. And on the 14th of February, Perth sailed from Fremantle to join what was then known as ABDACOM, the Joint American, British and Dutch Australian Command. ABDACOM was an absolute shambles. Nobody knew who was doing what. At this stage of the war, the Allies are in chaos. The Japanese are invincible, it seemed, and unstoppable. So late in February, they left Surabaya on the east side of Java to go in search of the Japanese invasion force coming down from the Philippines. There was a handful of cruisers, one British, two Dutch, one American, the Houston, and the Australian cruiser Perth. Eventually they encountered the enemy north of Java, and it was an absolute catastrophe.